The insurgents thought the base medical clinic would be an easy target, just nurses and defenseless patients. Nina Brooks looked like any other contractor nurse in her scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. What they didn't know was that 18 months ago she'd been a Navy SEAL combat medic with 6 years in special operations. When 50 insurgents breached the perimeter at 0340 hours and 15 of them headed straight for her clinic, Nina had 60 seconds to make a choice: hide and hope, or grab the M4 rifle and body armor she'd kept hidden in her locker. She chose violence. 9 insurgents learned the hard way that some nurses remember a different kind of training. Nina Brooks had been out of naval special warfare for 18 months when she took the contractor nursing position at Forward Operating Base Sentinel in the Horn of Africa, a small U.S. military installation in Djibouti supporting counterterrorism operations across the region. The transition from SEAL to civilian nurse had been difficult. After 6 years of high-intensity combat operations, 6 years of being part of an elite team conducting missions that made international news without anyone knowing who'd actually done the work, returning to normal life had felt impossible. So she'd taken a middle path: contractor medical work at forward operating bases, still supporting military operations, still in dangerous regions, but working as a nurse rather than a combat operator. Treating routine injuries instead of conducting direct action raids, wearing scrubs instead of body armor. It was supposed to be safer, quieter. A way to stay connected to military medicine without the constant danger of special operations. Nina had the qualifications for both roles. Before joining the Navy, she'd completed nursing school and worked 2 years in a civilian emergency room. Then she'd enlisted, gone through BUD/S training, earned her SEAL Trident, and spent the next 6 years as a Special Operations Combat Medic. The SEAL who kept teammates alive when they were shot, the one who could perform emergency surgery in a dirt compound while under fire, the one who carried medical gear and weapons with equal proficiency. She'd left the teams after her final deployment ended with a firefight in Syria that had killed 2 of her teammates, despite her best efforts to save them. The grief and guilt had been overwhelming. She'd completed her enlistment, declined to re-enlist, and returned to civilian medicine. But civilian emergency rooms in the United States had felt wrong. Too clean, too safe, too disconnected from the military community she'd spent years serving. So she'd taken the contractor position at FOB Sentinel. The pay was good. The work was meaningful, providing medical care to soldiers and local nationals in a region where quality health care was scarce, and the environment was familiar enough to feel comfortable, but different enough from special operations that she wasn't constantly reminded of her lost teammates. FOB Sentinel was small, maybe 200 U.S. personnel plus local national workers, and partnered African military forces. The base had basic amenities: living quarters, dining facility, operations center, gym, and the medical clinic where Nina worked. The clinic was a single-story concrete building with 6 treatment rooms, a small pharmacy, and a ward with 20 beds for patients who needed overnight observation. The medical staff consisted of 2 military doctors, 4 nurses, Nina and 3 others, and several medics. They treated everything from routine sick call to combat injuries, from partnered forces conducting operations in hostile areas. Nina had settled into a routine over 3 months at Sentinel. Morning sick call, treating minor ailments. Afternoon, treating local nationals who came to the base for humanitarian medical assistance. Evening, restocking supplies and updating patient records. Night shifts, rotating with other nurses to monitor overnight patients. It was productive work, important work. But it wasn't challenging in the way that SEAL operations had been challenging. There was no adrenaline, no life-or-death decisions under fire, no teamwork with operators who trusted each other with their lives. She missed it sometimes, the intensity, the purpose, the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. But she'd made her choice. She was a nurse now, not a SEAL. That part of her life was over, or so she'd thought. The attack came at 0340 hours on a Tuesday morning during Nina's night shift. She'd been in the clinic ward checking on 5 patients, 3 soldiers recovering from minor injuries, and 2 local national children being treated for severe dehydration after their village's water source had been contaminated. The first indication something was wrong was the explosion, a massive blast from the direction of the base perimeter that shook the building and shattered 2 windows. Nina had immediately gone to the ground, her SEAL training taking over before her conscious mind processed what was happening. Incoming attack, explosion at perimeter, possible breach. The base alarm began wailing, a loud oscillating siren that meant hostile action. Over the loudspeakers, a voice shouted, "Base under attack! All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill." Nina had scrambled to her feet and looked at her patients. The 3 soldiers were already moving, grabbing weapons and gear that had been stored near their beds. But the 2 children, both under 10 years old, were terrified, crying, not understanding what was happening. "Stay down!" Nina had shouted to the children in their language. She'd learned enough Arabic during her SEAL deployments to give basic commands. "Stay in bed! I'll protect you!" More explosions outside, automatic weapons fire, the distinctive sound of AK-47s mixing with the heavier reports of American M4 rifles and belt-fed machine guns. A full-scale attack on the base. The 3 soldier patients had run out of the ward toward defensive positions, leaving Nina alone with the 2 children and 3 other patients in different parts of the clinic. A soldier with a broken leg who couldn't move quickly, and 2 more local nationals being treated for various ailments. Nina had grabbed her radio. All medical staff carried communications equipment. "Medical to operations, we have 5 non-ambulatory patients in the clinic, including 2 children. What's the situation?" The response had been chaotic, multiple voices talking over each other, the sound of gunfire in the background. Finally, someone had responded. "Medical, this is operations. Insurgent force approximately 50 strong has breached the north perimeter. They're moving toward the operations center, and stand by." A pause. More gunfire over the radio. Then, "Medical, be advised, enemy element appears to be moving toward your building. Estimate 10 to 15 hostiles approaching from north. Quick reaction force is engaging, but you need to prepare for possible assault on medical facility." Nina's blood had run cold. The clinic was being targeted. Insurgents were moving toward a building full of defenseless patients and medical staff who weren't trained or equipped for combat. "Operations, medical copies. Do we evacuate patients or defend in place?" "Medical, no time for evacuation. Lock down and defend. QRF will reach you as soon as possible, but they're engaged with main enemy force. You're on your own for at least 5 to 10 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes might as well be forever when armed insurgents were approaching a building full of wounded people. Nina had made a decision in that moment. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a SEAL who'd spent 6 years training for exactly this kind of situation. And she wasn't going to let insurgents murder patients under her care. She'd run to the clinic's storage room where medical supplies were kept. In the back, hidden behind boxes of bandages, was something the other medical staff didn't know about. A small personal locker where Nina kept equipment from her SEAL days that she'd never quite been able to leave behind. She'd opened the locker and pulled out gear she hadn't touched in 18 months. Body armor plate carrier with ceramic plates, tactical belt with magazine pouches, fighting knife, tactical gloves, and most importantly, her personal Glock 19 pistol with 4 loaded magazines. She'd also grabbed something else from the locker, a small first aid kit that contained specialized combat medical supplies, including tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, and chest seals. Because if shooting started, people were going to get wounded. Nina had quickly donned the plate carrier over her nurse's scrubs, clipped the tactical belt around her waist, loaded the Glock and stuck it in her belt holster, stuffed the extra magazines in pouches, and strapped the knife to her leg. The transformation from nurse to combat operator had taken less than 60 seconds. She'd grabbed one more item from the storage room, an M4 carbine that was stored there for security purposes. Standard protocol on forward operating bases, weapon storage in key facilities in case of emergency. She'd checked the rifle, loaded magazine, round in chamber, safety on, ready to fire. From the ward, one of the other nurses, a young Army specialist named Johnson, had appeared in the doorway and stopped, staring at Nina in shock. What? What are you doing? Why do you have body armor? Where did you get that rifle? Johnson, listen carefully, Nina had said, her voice absolutely calm despite the chaos outside. I need you to take the patients in the ward and move them to the interior storage room. No windows there, concrete walls, barricade the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. But the protocols say we're supposed to forget the protocols. Insurgents are about to assault this building. If they get in, they'll kill everyone. I'm going to stop them. You're going to protect the patients. Move now. Something in Nina's voice, the command authority that came from years of leading combat operations, had made Johnson stop arguing. She'd nodded and run back to the ward to start moving patients. Nina had moved through the clinic, quickly checking all entrances. The building had 3 doors, main entrance in front, emergency exit in back, and a side door near the treatment rooms. All were locked, but locks wouldn't stop determined attackers. She'd positioned herself at the main entrance, taking cover behind a concrete wall that gave her a clear line of sight to the door while protecting her from incoming fire. The M4 rifle was up and ready. The Glock was back up in her belt holster. Her medical supplies were in pouches on her tactical belt. Outside, the gunfire was getting closer. She could hear shouting in Arabic, multiple voices coordinating movement. The insurgents were approaching. Nina had keyed her radio. Operations medical. I have patients secured in interior room. I'm defending main entrance. How far out is the QRF? Medical, QRF is still engaged with main assault force. You're looking at 5 minutes minimum before we can get support to you. Can you hold that long? Nina had looked at the M4 in her hands. 4 magazines, 120 rounds total, plus her pistol with 4 more magazines, 68 rounds. She had nearly 200 rounds of ammunition and 6 years of combat experience. Operations, I can hold. Medical, are you trained for combat operations? Your file says you're a contractor nurse. My file doesn't tell you everything. I've got this. Brooks out. She'd switched her radio to the emergency frequency so she could hear base-wide communications while focusing on the immediate threat. 30 seconds later, the first insurgent had appeared outside the main entrance. Through the small window in the door, Nina had seen him. A man in his 30s wearing civilian clothing and carrying an AK-47, moving toward the door with 2 more fighters behind him. The lead insurgent had tried the door handle, found it locked, then stepped back and raised his AK-47 to shoot the lock. Nina had fired first, 3 rounds through the door at center mass range. The door was wood, not armored. The 5.56 millimeter rounds had punched through easily. The insurgent had dropped. The 2 behind him had scattered, shouting in alarm. Nina had moved immediately. Her SEAL training told her to never stay in one position after firing. She'd repositioned to a different angle that still covered the main entrance, but from a new location. More shouting outside, the insurgents regrouping, trying to figure out what had just happened. They'd expected an undefended medical facility. They hadn't expected return fire. The attack had resumed with intensity. Multiple insurgents had opened fire on the front of the building, their AK-47s spraying bullets that tore through the door and shattered windows. Nina had stayed low behind concrete walls, letting the initial barrage pass. When the firing paused, insurgents reloading or preparing to rush the entrance, She'd popped up and fired controlled bursts at figures visible outside. 2 more insurgents had gone down. Operations, medical. 3 hostiles down at main entrance. They're regrouping. I need that QRF now. Medical. QRF is moving to you. ETA 2 minutes. Hold on. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. Nina could hold for that long, but then she'd heard something that changed the tactical situation. The sound of breaking glass from the back of the building. The emergency exit. The insurgents were attempting a 2-pronged assault, some at the front entrance to pin her down, others breaching from the rear. Nina had to make an immediate decision: defend the front entrance where the main assault was happening, or fall back to protect the interior of the building and the room where patients were sheltered. She'd chosen the latter. Better to give up the entrance and create a defendable position protecting the patients than get caught between 2 assault forces. She'd moved quickly through the clinic toward the interior hallway that led to the storage room where Johnson had taken the patients. The hallway was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with concrete walls on both sides and a heavy door at the end leading to the storage room. It was a natural choke point. Anyone trying to reach the patients would have to come down that hallway where Nina could engage them from a protected position. She'd taken up a defensive position at the end of the hallway, using a concrete corner for cover, her M4 aimed down the corridor toward the clinic's interior. From the back of the building, she'd heard the emergency door crash open, insurgent voices shouting, multiple footsteps entering the building. Then they'd appeared in the hallway. 3 insurgents with AK-47s moving in a tactical stack looking for targets. Nina had opened fire. The narrow hallway became a fatal funnel. The insurgents had nowhere to go. Concrete walls on both sides, Nina's accurate fire cutting down the corridor. The lead insurgent had dropped immediately. The second had tried to return fire, but his rounds impacted the concrete wall protecting Nina. She'd engaged him with controlled bursts. He'd fallen. The third insurgent had tried to retreat, realizing the assault was failing. Nina had put 2 rounds in his back as he turned, 3 more down. The hallway floor was now littered with bodies and spent brass casings. Nina had quickly reloaded her M4, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training, and called out to Johnson in the storage room, 3 hostiles down in rear hallway. Stay in that room. Don't come out. Copy! Johnson's terrified voice had responded through the door. More gunfire from the front of the building. The insurgents weren't giving up. They were pressing the assault despite taking casualties. Nina had moved back toward the front entrance, staying low, using cover. Through the shattered windows, she could see the situation outside. At least 6 more insurgents taking positions around the building's perimeter, preparing for another assault. She'd engaged targets of opportunity, quick shots at insurgents who exposed themselves, forcing them to stay behind cover rather than advancing. But she was running low on ammunition, 2 magazines remaining for the M4. The firefight had already consumed half her ammo load. And then the tactical situation changed again. One of the insurgents had thrown something through a broken window, a grenade. Nina's training had saved her life. She'd recognized the shape and trajectory immediately, identified where it would land, and thrown herself behind a concrete wall in the split second before detonation. The grenade had exploded in the middle of the clinic's main room, a tremendous blast that shattered everything, sent shrapnel tearing through the space, and momentarily deafened Nina despite the concrete wall protecting her. Her ears were ringing. Smoke and dust filled the air. But she was alive. The insurgents had used the grenade as cover for a renewed assault. 3 of them had rushed through the main entrance while Nina was still recovering from the blast. They'd spread out in the destroyed clinic interior, weapons up, looking for targets. Nina had been behind them, at an angle they weren't expecting. She'd engaged the first insurgent from her position of cover. 3 rounds center mass he dropped. The second insurgent had turned and fired at her, his AK-47 rounds impacting near her position. She'd returned fire, hit him twice, he'd gone down. The third insurgent had been the most dangerous. He'd immediately identified her position and charged while firing, trying to close the distance before she could effectively engage. Nina had fired her M4. 2 rounds hit, but he kept coming, either high on adrenaline or wearing some kind of body armor under his clothing. He'd been 10 feet away when her M4 had run dry. Magazine empty, no time to reload. She'd dropped the rifle and drawn her Glock pistol in a smooth transition, bringing it up as the insurgent closed the distance. She'd fired rapidly, 5 rounds at close range into his upper chest and head. He'd dropped 3 feet from her position. Silence. The immediate assault was over. Nina had quickly reloaded both weapons, conducted a rapid check of the building. 9 insurgents were down inside or immediately outside the clinic. More were dead or wounded in the perimeter area from her defensive fire. She'd keyed her radio. Operations, medical. I've repelled the assault on medical facility. Multiple hostiles down. Patients are secure. Where's that QRF? Medical, QRF is at your position in 30 seconds. Hold fire. Friendlies approaching from the south. Nina had moved to a position where she could observe the southern approach. Sure enough, a squad of U.S. soldiers in full combat gear was advancing rapidly toward the clinic, weapons up, moving tactically. She'd called out, "Friendly in the building! Medical staff, don't shoot!" The squad had entered cautiously, their expressions shocked as they'd seen the carnage. Multiple dead insurgents, bullet damage everywhere, and Nina standing there in body armor over nurses' scrubs, holding an M4 rifle and covered in dust from the grenade blast. The squad leader, a sergeant, had stared at her in disbelief. "What the hell happened here?" "Who are you?" "Nina Brooks, contractor nurse. I defended the facility while waiting for QRF arrival." "You defended? By yourself? Against how many?" "I count 9 hostiles down in or around the building, more engaged at distance." The sergeant had looked at the bodies, at the defensive positions Nina had held, at the evidence of professional tactical fighting throughout the building. "You're not just a nurse," he'd said flatly. "I'm also not just a nurse," Nina had agreed. "Check your rosters. Nina Brooks, former SEAL Team 3, combat medic, 6 years operational. Now I'm a contractor." But I remember my training. Understanding had dawned on the sergeant's face. "You're one of them. Special operations. That's how you—" He'd gestured at the scene of devastation. "That's how I kept 50 patients alive until you arrived," Nina had finished. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on those patients and treat any wounded." She'd moved to the storage room and opened the door. Johnson and the patients had been huddled inside, terrified but unharmed. The 2 children had been crying. The soldier with the broken leg had been pale with shock. "It's over," Nina had told them calmly. "You're safe. Let's get you back to the ward." Over the next hour, as the base had secured the perimeter and accounted for casualties, the full picture of the attack had emerged. A force of approximately 50 insurgents had attempted to overrun FOB Sentinel in a coordinated assault. They'd breached the perimeter in 2 locations, targeting the operations center and the medical facility. The operations center had been successfully defended by the Guard Force and Quick Reaction Force, but the medical facility, which should have been overrun in minutes, had held because of a single nurse who turned out to be a former Navy SEAL. Final count for the clinic assault: 14 insurgents killed, 6 more wounded and captured. 9 of those kills had been Nina's, accomplished while defending patients and holding multiple defensive positions against overwhelming numbers. U.S. casualties at the clinic, 0. Not a single patient or medical staff member had been injured during the assault. By dawn, the base commander, a colonel, had come to the clinic to personally inspect the damage and debrief Nina. He'd walked through the building, looking at the tactical positions she'd held, the fields of fire she'd established, the professional defensive fighting she'd conducted. "Ms. Brooks," he'd finally said, "your file says you're a contractor nurse. It says nothing about special operations background." "My contractor file is limited to civilian medical qualifications, sir. My military service record is separate." "I'm looking at your military record now. 6 years as a SEAL combat medic, multiple deployments, Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, Combat Action Ribbon. You left the teams 18 months ago with an honorable discharge. Why didn't you mention this background when you came to work here?" "Because I was hired as a nurse, sir. I came here to provide medical care, not to conduct combat operations. My SEAL service was in the past." The colonel had studied her for a long moment. "Except when 50 insurgents attack your clinic and 50 patients need defending. Then your past became very relevant very quickly." "Yes, sir. You saved every single person in this building. You held off a numerically superior force using professional tactics and marksmanship until reinforcements arrived. That's not past performance. That's current capability that we should have known about." He'd paused, then continued, "I'm recommending you for a decoration for your actions last night. I'm also asking if you'd be willing to expand your role here beyond just nursing. We could use someone with your combination of medical expertise and tactical capability." Nina had considered it. She'd left the SEALs because she couldn't handle losing more teammates. She'd become a nurse because she wanted to save lives, not take them. But last night she'd done both. She'd defended patients and killed enemies who were trying to murder defenseless people. She'd used her SEAL training and her medical skills simultaneously. Maybe there was a way to integrate both parts of herself, the warrior and the healer, instead of trying to suppress one or the other. "What did you have in mind, sir?" 3 days later, Nina had been offered a new position, medical security coordinator. She'd continue working as a nurse providing patient care, but she'd also be responsible for training medical staff in defensive tactics, establishing security protocols for the clinic, and serving as armed security when patients were particularly vulnerable or threat levels were high. It was a hybrid role that acknowledged both her capabilities, nurse and warrior, healer and protector. She'd accepted. 6 months later, Nina was training every member of the medical staff at FOB Sentinel in basic defensive tactics: how to secure a building under attack, how to move patients to safe locations, how to use weapons if absolutely necessary. She'd turned the clinic into a hardened facility with reinforced doors, defensive positions, and emergency protocols. But more importantly, she'd found peace with her past. She didn't have to choose between being a SEAL and being a nurse. She could be both. She could use her warrior skills to protect the patients she cared for as a healer. The other medical staff had come to respect her, not just as a competent nurse, but as someone who'd proven she would literally stand between patients and death, armed with whatever tools were necessary to keep people safe. And when new nurses arrived at FOB Sentinel, they always heard the story. The night the base was attacked and everyone thought the medical clinic would be overrun, until they learned that the quiet nurse who treated their sprained ankles and dehydration was actually a Navy SEAL who'd spent 6 years conducting special operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The 2 children she'd protected that night, the ones with severe dehydration, had made full recoveries. Their families had returned to the base specifically to thank Nina, bringing gifts and expressing gratitude in broken English mixed with Arabic. The children had hugged her, not understanding that the kind nurse who'd given them IV fluids was the same person who'd killed 9 armed men to keep them safe. That's what Nina had realized. Being a warrior and being a healer weren't contradictory. They were complementary. Sometimes the best way to save lives was with medical skills, bandages, medications, surgical interventions. Sometimes the best way to save lives was with tactical skills, defensive positions, accurate marksmanship, professional violence applied at the right moment against the right targets. She'd spent 18 months trying to leave her SEAL identity behind, thinking it was incompatible with being a nurse. That night's attack had taught her otherwise. The most effective protector is someone who can both heal wounds and prevent them, someone who understands human anatomy well enough to save lives in an operating room and to end threats efficiently in combat. Johnson, the young Army nurse who'd witnessed Nina's transformation from colleague to warrior, had asked her weeks later, "How do you reconcile it?" Saving lives and taking lives, Nina had thought carefully before responding. "I don't see them as opposites. Every life I took that night was in defense of lives I was protecting. The 9 insurgents who died, they made the choice to attack a medical facility full of defenseless patients. I made the choice to stop them. Both were choices about protecting innocent people." But doesn't it bother you? The killing? What bothers me is when I can't save someone who deserves saving. 2 of my teammates died on my last SEAL deployment despite everything I tried medically. That haunts me. The insurgents who died attacking patients under my care? That doesn't haunt me at all. They chose violence against the defenseless. I chose to defend the defenseless. Those aren't morally equivalent positions. The base chaplain had come to speak with Nina after the attack, concerned about the psychological impact of killing 9 people in close-quarters combat. Nina had appreciated the concern, but explained that she'd processed combat violence years ago during her SEAL career. What she'd struggled with was feeling helpless when teammates died, despite her medical interventions. This had been different. She hadn't been helpless. She'd been exactly what the situation required. "I think some people are called to be healers," she'd told the chaplain, "and some people are called to be warriors. I'm one of the rare people called to be both. For 18 months I tried to be only a healer. That night taught me I can't suppress half of who I am. I'm most effective when I embrace both roles." The chaplain had nodded understanding. "The shepherd who protects the flock from wolves. You heal the sheep and fight the wolves." Exactly. 1 year after the attack, Nina received a letter from the mother of one of the children she'd protected. It had been translated from Arabic to English by base interpreters. "Dear Nurse Nina, my daughter speaks of you often. She says you are the strong woman who kept her safe when bad men came. She wants to grow up to be like you, someone who helps people and protects them. Thank you for saving my child's life. You are a blessing. May God protect you always." Nina had kept that letter in her locker, reading it whenever she questioned whether she'd made the right choices. She was just the base nurse, until enemies attacked and met a hidden SEAL with a stethoscope. Then she became exactly what 50 defenseless patients needed, someone who could bandage wounds and eliminate threats with equal proficiency. Some people carry more than one set of skills. The most dangerous warriors are often the ones nobody expects. And the best protectors are those who understand that sometimes the most compassionate act is standing between innocence and violence, armed with whatever tools are necessary to keep people safe. Nina Brooks had been a SEAL who became a nurse. Now she was a nurse who remembered she was also a SEAL, and that made her the most dangerous person in the room to threaten, and the safest person in the room to trust with your life. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories every day.